My grandfather served in Vietnam. My father fought in Desert Storm. My brother Marcus died during a live training mission in Afghanistan. And me, I was supposed to be next. Supposed to carry the legacy. Supposed to wear the uniform. Supposed to shut down my emotions and follow orders. Instead, I broke the chain. And in return, they broke me. I still remember the summer I turned 8. Most kids my age were at baseball camp learning how to hit line drives and collect fireflies in jars. I was at a military-style boot camp for boys that my father ran behind our house. The drills started at 5 a.m., complete with cold water hose wake-up calls and punishment runs through barbed fences. Every time I cried, my father would say the same thing. Crying is for the weak. Pain builds men. I was raised in a house where emotions were treated like landmines, dangerous and best avoided. Fear was punished. Sadness was mocked. Vulnerability, that was treason. By the time I was 12, I'd learned to keep my mouth shut, my eyes dry, and my back straight. I said yes, sir, even when I wanted to scream. When my brother Marcus got deployed at 19, my father threw him a party like he was going off to win the Super Bowl. The night before he left, I caught Marcus sitting alone in the garage, drinking in silence. I asked if he was scared. He didn't answer. He just handed me the beer and said, "Don't ask questions like that. You'll make Dad think you're soft." 6 months later, Marcus came back in a flag-covered coffin. At the funeral, my father didn't cry. I did. A single tear. He saw it and whispered, "Not here. Not now. Not ever." The expectation was clear. I was next. My SAT scores didn't matter. My art portfolio meant nothing. When I got accepted to an East Coast university with a scholarship for design, my father tore the letter in half and said, "You're not going to school to paint. You're going to earn the uniform." And for a while, I believed I had no choice. This is not a story about war. This is not about medals or ranks or duty. This is about what happens when you inherit pain dressed up as pride. It's about when trauma becomes tradition and questioning that tradition makes you the enemy. If you'd asked me 5 years ago what broke me, I would have told you it was a panic attack during a weapons drill. But the truth is, I was already broken before that. Broken by generations of silence, of stoicism, of boys don't cry. I broke the chain, and they made sure I'd never forget it. Let me tell you how. I was born in Killeen, Texas, just 15 minutes outside of Fort Cavazos, one of the largest military bases in the country. Growing up, the sound of helicopters overhead was as normal to me as birdsong. Camouflage wasn't just a uniform, it was our family identity. The walls of our living room were lined with framed metals unit photos and folded flags. And in the center of it all was my father. Master Sergeant Robert Dean, retired but always in uniform, if not on his body, then in his tone. He was a towering man with a flat-top haircut that never grew out of style, and a jaw clenched so tight it seemed locked in place. He never raised his voice, but somehow that made everything he said more terrifying. His silences were judgments. His glances were commands. His belt, always within reach, was not just for holding up pants. Then there was my mother, Linda. Quiet, faithful, always dressed like she was waiting for a church meeting or a funeral. I don't know if she believed in what Dad did or if she was just too tired to resist it. She cooked, she prayed, she kept the house clean, and when Dad disciplined us, she never looked up. I used to think that meant she didn't care. Later, I realized she was just surviving like the rest of us. My older brother, Marcus, was everything I wasn't. Strong, charismatic, athletic. The golden child. He joined ROTC in high school, and by the time he was 17, he was already giving orders like a young officer. Dad adored him, called him the pride of the Dean line. Whenever Marcus walked into a room, Dad's chest puffed out a little more. Me, I was the artist, the reader, the soft one. I loved sketching animals, building tiny models, reading biographies. I kept a notebook full of character designs and story ideas. I once told my mom I wanted to be an animator at Pixar. She looked at me like I'd spoken in a foreign language. "You should talk to your father about that," she said. I never did. At school, I was quiet but capable. Straight A's, never in trouble. I joined art club debate team, even helped design sets for the spring musicals. Teachers loved me. Friends said I was easy to be around. But none of that counted for much when I got home. Dad didn't care about trophies unless they came with stripes and ribbons. He didn't understand art unless it was drawn on a mission map. Every Sunday was family formation. That's what Dad called it. We'd sit in the living room in formation backs, straight hands on thighs, while he delivered briefings on the week. Chores, grades, discipline. Each session ended with his signature line, "We are deans. We serve. We don't whine. And we never show weakness." Marcus would repeat it with pride. I mouthed the words, heart pounding. Sometimes I wondered what it would be like to grow up in a different house, one where fathers hugged their sons instead of drilling them, where "how are you feeling" was asked and not mocked. But I knew better than to dream too long. In our house, dreams were for the lazy. Emotions were liabilities. Still, I held on to them in secret. I kept a journal. I drew pictures under my bed with a flashlight. I wrote letters to myself pretending they were from the kind of father I wished I had. It was my only way to stay sane. When Marcus died in that training mission overseas, it felt like the sun had been shot out of the sky. For a moment, I thought everything might change. That maybe finally Dad would cry. Maybe he'd look at me not as a replacement, but as a son. Instead, he saluted the flag at Marcus's funeral with dry eyes and steel posture. Then he turned to me and said, "It's your turn now." I was 17. That fall, I got an acceptance letter to a top design program on the East Coast. Full scholarship, a dream come true. I showed it to Dad. He didn't even read past the first line. "You're not wasting your future drawing cartoons," he said. "You're enlisting." He had already spoken to a recruiter. My name was already on a waiting list. And so began the hardest decision of my life: follow the path laid out by generations or carve one that might cost me everything. I enlisted 2 weeks after graduation. The recruiter gave me a long handshake, called me Young Lion, and handed me a folder thick with forms I didn't understand. Dad stood behind me the whole time, arms folded, eyes gleaming with something that looked a lot like pride but colder, sharper. I didn't sign those papers for my country. I signed them because I didn't know how to say no. Basic training was brutal, but it wasn't the physical part that broke me. It was the mental war. Every second, every movement, every breath was calculated. Mistakes weren't corrected, they were punished. There was no space to be human, only efficient. One night, during a routine field exercise, a guy in my unit tripped and dislocated his knee. I stopped to help him instinctively, before remembering we weren't supposed to break formation. The drill sergeant caught me and screamed until I felt smaller than my boots. Later that night, I sat alone under a rusted awning and stared at the rain, shaking teeth clenched to keep the sobs inside. The next morning, I woke up with chest pain, shallow breathing, and a sense that the world was about to collapse. I didn't know it then, but it was my first panic attack. I told the base medic. He handed me a bottle of water and told me to walk it off. When I called home that weekend, I mentioned the episode to my mom. I didn't go into detail, just said I'd been feeling overwhelmed. She passed the phone to Dad before I could explain further. "Anxiety," he repeated, his voice flat. "You've been reading too many articles." "Dad, I'm just saying." "No, you're making excuses," he cut in. "You think I never got nervous in the jungle. You think your grandfather didn't shake in his boots every night for 3 years. But we didn't call it a condition. We called it being a man. After that call, I stopped mentioning how I felt. But my body didn't stop. The panic attacks came more often. I couldn't sleep. My chest hurt constantly. I lost 10 pounds in 2 months. Every time I looked in the mirror, I saw someone shrinking. The final straw came during a live fire drill. We were crawling under barbed wire as machine guns fired overhead, the sound deafening the dirt soaked from the night before. I froze. My arms refused to move. My brain screamed at me to go, but my body said no. I lay there face down in the mud, shaking. When they pulled me out, the officer called me dead weight. I was medically discharged 2 weeks later with a vague diagnosis adjustment disorder with panic features. It was the military's way of saying, "You don't belong here," without calling it failure. I came home quietly, without ceremony. Mom met me at the airport. Dad didn't come. Back at the house, the walls hadn't changed. Marcus's medals still gleamed under glass. My childhood room was exactly the same, except one thing: Dad had placed a folded American flag on my bed, the one they gave me when I left. I don't know if it was meant as a gift or a warning. We barely spoke that first week. He walked past me like I wasn't there. Then one morning, I found him in the kitchen polishing his old rifle. Still waking up screaming, he asked without turning around. I blinked. How did you walls are thin?" He stood and faced me. "You didn't even make it through a year. I tried. No, you quit." His voice wasn't angry. It was worse than that. It was empty. From that moment on, I became a ghost in my own house. Conversations stopped when I entered the room. My mother hovered, but never helped. Dad made sure I knew I'd embarrassed the family name. "You had one job," he told me once. "Carry the legacy. Marcus did. I did. My father did. And you threw it away because you got scared." It wasn't fear I wanted to scream. It was suffocation. It was drowning in a uniform that didn't fit. It was dying by degrees because no one in our family believed in oxygen. Only pressure. I lasted 2 more months before I packed a duffel bag and left. I didn't even say goodbye. I took a bus west with no plan, slept in motels, got a job bussing tables in Portland. Eventually, I found a community college where I could take art classes again. I started therapy, though it took me 3 sessions to say anything real. I remember telling my therapist, "I'm not here to blame my family. I just need to figure out why I feel like a traitor all the time." She said, "Maybe because no one ever let you be anything else." I moved to Eugene a year later and enrolled in a university there. Switched majors 3 times before landing an education. Something about being around kids, about watching them express emotions freely, started to undo parts of me I didn't realize were still clenched. One day in class, a 6th grader named Henry started crying because he forgot his lines during a school play. The other kids didn't tease him. They hugged him. I sat there and realized I had never been given that. At night, I still dreamt of Marcus. Sometimes he was yelling at me. Sometimes he was silent. Sometimes he was just sitting in that garage handing me a beer and shaking his head. I told myself I was healing, that I'd broken free. But the truth was I'd just run far enough that the silence was easier to ignore. Then I got the call. "Your dad's in the hospital," my mom said. "Stroke. He's stable, but he's asking for you." I didn't know what shocked me more, that he'd had a stroke or that he wanted to see me. I bought a plane ticket that night. On the flight back to Texas, I tried to prepare myself. Maybe this would be closure. Maybe I'd find a man softened by mortality. Maybe we could talk even for just a minute like father and son. But nothing could have prepared me for what I found waiting in that house. When I arrived at the hospital, my father was asleep. The stroke had left the right side of his face slightly drooped, but his posture, even in the hospital bed, was rigid. His jaw clenched, his hands folded tightly over the thin blanket. He looked like a man still trying to stand at attention, even while his body betrayed him. My mother sat in the corner, her purse on her lap, spine straight. She glanced at me when I entered, gave a small nod, then looked away. No words. I pulled a chair next to the bed and sat in silence, watching the monitors beep and blink with mechanical calm. After 20 minutes, he stirred. His eyes fluttered open, landing on me slowly. For a moment, he didn't speak. Then he whispered, You came. I did. You left. I had to. He exhaled sharply through his nose. I couldn't tell if it was a laugh or a scoff. Still soft. I stood up, ready to walk out. I didn't ask you here to argue, he said quickly, his voice rough with strain. There's something you should see. He motioned toward the drawer by the window. Confused, I opened it and found a key, an old one rusted, attached to a faded dog tag. Garage, the red locker. That was all he said before drifting back into a sedated sleep. I didn't go home that night. I checked into a motel off the highway. My childhood home didn't feel like a place I wanted to sleep. The next morning, I let myself in with the spare key still hidden under the porch mat. The house smelled the same. Dusty curtains, old gun oil, my mother's lavender soap. Nothing had changed. In the garage, the red locker stood in the corner behind a wall of half-used paint cans and tangled extension cords. I hadn't seen it opened in years. I'd assumed it was full of tools. The key turned with a click. Inside were 3 things: a metal box, a shoebox labeled Marcus, and a stack of old notebooks tied together with a shoelace. The notebooks belonged to my grandfather. I opened the top one and started to read. It began in 1971 in Da Nang, Vietnam. I saw a boy today, maybe 15, holding a grenade like a toy. My CO told me to shoot. I did. I still see him at night. I can't tell anyone. We're supposed to be strong. But I don't sleep anymore. The entries continued. Dozens of them. Descriptions of night sweats, of trembling hands, of suicidal thoughts. Each one followed by self-condemnation. This is weakness. This is shame. No one must ever know. I opened another journal. This one belonged to my father. The first page read, I will not be like him. But he was. Every page chronicled his own slow unraveling, his fury, his helplessness, his fear. There were entries about nightmares, about waking up thinking he was back in the desert, about drinking to forget. One line stopped me cold. When Marcus left, I told him not to feel. I told him to bury it all. Now I wonder if I buried my own sons with those words. I stood in the garage for hours, flipping pages, watching the myth of our family collapse under the weight of hidden truths. All those years, I thought I was the weak one, the broken link. But the truth was, the chain had been rusting for generations. I found more letters never sent a medical evaluation recommending psychiatric care that my grandfather had crumpled and shoved into a folder. A photo of Marcus in uniform smiling with a note on the back in Dad's handwriting. He looks brave. But he cried the night before, just like I did. Just like my father did. That night, I returned to the hospital. My father was awake. I laid the journals on the tray table in front of him. He stared at them unmoving. I read them, I said. He didn't respond. All these years I thought you were strong, but you were scared too. You just didn't know how to say it. Still silence. I'm not here to humiliate you. I just need to know, why didn't you ever tell me? His eyes were locked on the ceiling. We don't talk about those things, he said after a long moment. Why not? Because if you talk about them, they become real. And if they're real, they can hurt you. Or worse, they can make you hurt the people you love. But hiding them hurt us anyway. He didn't answer, just turned his head away. I left the journals on the table and walked out. The next day, my mother called. He's asking for you. When I arrived, he was sitting up, the journals open in front of him. I forgot about these, he said. No, you hid them. He gave a small nod. Thought they'd die with me. Why? Because no one wants to be the first to say they're broken. We sat in silence. For once, it wasn't hostile. I need to tell you something, he said. I waited. I told Marcus to toughen up. The night before he deployed, he came to me. Said he wasn't ready, said he couldn't sleep. And I told him sleep is for cowards. That was the last thing I ever said to him. His voice broke. I never cried for him. Not once. I didn't know how. I nodded slowly. We can start now, I said. He didn't cry. Not yet. But something in him cracked. 2 days later, he was discharged. I stayed for another week. We didn't talk much, but we also didn't avoid each other. That was new. Before I left, he handed me a letter. To my son, it read, I don't know how to be a father who apologizes, but I know you deserve one. You broke the chain, and I hope one day I'll have the strength to thank you for that. Until then, don't stop. I'm proud of you, even if I never figured out how to show it. I flew back to Oregon with the letter in my coat pocket and the journals in my bag. Back home, I decided to do something different. I started speaking about it. At a teachers' conference, I gave a presentation on emotional resilience in boys. I told them my story, the chain, the garage, the letter. The audience was silent. Afterwards, a man in his 50s came up to me, eyes glassy. My dad was Navy, he said. I haven't spoken to him in 12 years. I'm going to call him. A woman followed. My son hides everything. Now I think I know why. That night, I lay in bed and stared at the ceiling. I thought of Marcus, of Dad, of Grandpa. And for the first time, I didn't feel ashamed. I felt brave. After I gave that first talk at the teachers' conference, the emails started coming in. A high school counselor from Montana wrote to say he'd played the recording for his male students. A social worker in Ohio said my story helped her understand her foster kids better. A woman in Kansas told me she'd forwarded the video to her husband, an ex-Marine who hadn't spoken to their son in 5 years. The next day, they had lunch together. It stunned me, honestly. I never thought telling the truth about my family would mean anything to anyone but me. For so long, our silence had been sacred. Holy, even. Now the truth was out and people weren't turning away. They were leaning in. Still, healing wasn't linear, and it wasn't fast. I started writing every day, mostly for myself. But over time, those journal entries turned into essays. The essays turned into a blog. I called it The Chain. Each post explored one link, one inherited belief, one buried emotion, one memory I could no longer afford to keep in the dark. The first post was about Marcus. The second was about the night in the garage when I found the journals. The third was about the day I realized I didn't need to hate my father to forgive him. I didn't expect anyone to read it. Within 3 months, it had 50,000 subscribers. A Vietnam vet wrote in, My son doesn't speak to me. I see now why. A 22-year-old soldier wrote, I thought something was wrong with me. I didn't know you could serve your family by saying no. A 12-year-old boy wrote, I printed your story and gave it to my dad. He cried for the first time in my life. I cried, too. Meanwhile, I kept teaching. I started an after-school group for boys called Permission to Feel. No uniforms, no yelling, no drills, just space, safe space. We talked about anger, fear, shame, sadness, and joy. I showed them how to name emotions without judgment. We built things. We drew. We played music. We wrote letters to people we hadn't forgiven yet, and sometimes to people we never would. At first, it felt small, like a drop in a storm. But then one kid came back the next week. Then another brought a friend. Then a parent called and said, Whatever you're doing, my son actually talks now. Please don't stop. That was the moment I realized I hadn't just broken the chain. I was building something new in its place. Back in Texas, things remained complicated. My father and I spoke on the phone once a month, usually brief. Surface level, but different. Softer. On his birthday, I sent him a framed photo of Marcus and me when we were kids. On the back, I wrote, We were kids. Just kids. I wish someone had let us stay that way longer. He didn't reply. But 2 weeks later, he called and asked if I was still painting. I told him yes. He said, Good, keep doing that. That was it. It was more than I expected. My mother emailed me sometimes. forwarded recipes, photos of the garden. She never brought up the past, and I didn't push. I had to accept that her silence was still her shield. One day, a padded envelope arrived at my apartment in Eugene. No return address. Inside was a silver dog tag, a folded American flag, and a note. He would have followed you if he'd seen a way out. Thank you for showing one. It was unsigned, but I recognized my father's handwriting. I sat with that flag in my lap for an hour. Then I took it to my classroom and placed it on the shelf above my desk. Not as a trophy, not as a scar, but as a reminder that some battles don't come with medals, and those are the ones that matter most. Months passed. The blog grew. The chain was picked up by a nonprofit that helped veterans and their families. They asked if I'd be willing to travel and speak at some of their retreats. I said yes. The first event was in San Diego. 40 men, ages ranging from 25 to 70. Some had seen combat, others hadn't. All of them had inherited the same belief real men don't feel. We sat in a circle. I told my story. They told theirs. One man, a retired colonel, said I ordered men into battle. Never cried. Buried my own son last year and still haven't let myself mourn. But you made it okay for me to try. Another said I screamed at my kid last night for crying about a breakup. Thought I was making him tougher. Now I think I was just afraid of his feelings because I never learned to handle mine. I nodded silent. Not because I didn't know what to say, but because I'd finally learned that silence can be strength when it's chosen, not forced. When I returned home, I walked into my classroom to find a surprise waiting. The boys in my after-school group had painted a mural. It showed a giant chain being broken in the center with words scrawled across the links. Fear, silence, shame, anger, pressure, regret, pain. And on the other side, in bold colors, truth, vulnerability, forgiveness, joy, freedom. I stood there speechless. One of the boys, Trevor, 10 years old, walked up and handed me a note. You made it safe for me to talk about my dad. I don't feel like I'm weird anymore. I swallowed the lump in my throat. Neither am I whispered. Later that night, I got a call from Texas. My father. His voice was shaky. I read that last post, he said. You did? Yeah. A pause. You wrote about Marcus? Yeah. You said he cried before he left. He did. Another pause. I never let myself remember that. You can now. Long silence. Then I'm sorry. I didn't know what to say. I'd waited years for that word. But now that it came, it didn't feel like a finish line. It felt like an opening, a beginning. We talked for an hour that night, about nothing and everything. He told me about his therapy sessions. He said he'd started writing again. Just a little, just for himself. I told him I was proud. He chuckled, still soft. Still here, I replied. Before we hung up, he said something I never thought I'd hear. Thank you for not becoming me. I sat alone in my apartment for a long time after that. No tears. Just a quiet peace I hadn't known in years. Sometimes healing doesn't feel like fireworks. It feels like an unlocked door. That spring, I stood at the edge of a field during a community event. Hundreds of people had gathered, students, veterans, families. I'd been asked to speak, but I wasn't sure what I could say that hadn't already been said. Then I saw a boy, maybe 9, trip and fall in the grass. He didn't get up right away. He covered his face, clearly crying. And instead of looking away, his father knelt beside him, put a hand on his back, spoke gently, waited. I watched the boy take deep breaths. Then he stood. They walked back into the crowd together. I stepped up to the microphone. I come from a family where men didn't cry, I said, where feelings were weaknesses, where silence was sacred. And I almost passed that down to my students, until I realized that silence isn't strength. Courage is. I looked out over the crowd, and the bravest thing I ever did was say enough. I broke the chain. so my students wouldn't have to carry it. So your children won't have to carry it. I paused. And maybe, just maybe, so our fathers can finally set it down too. Applause. Not thunderous, not loud, just steady, solid, like the ground beneath your feet after years of shaking. That night, I called my dad. He didn't answer, but he texted, "Proud of you." 2 years later, I visited Texas again. My father had retired from his part-time security job. He was gardening, eating better, seeing a therapist every other week. We still didn't talk about feelings often, but we didn't have to anymore. The wall was down. We sat on the back porch one evening watching the sun dip behind the fence. "You ever think about Marcus?" he asked. "Every day. Me too. He didn't cry. I didn't either. But for the first time, it didn't feel like we were holding anything back. We just sat, side by side. Two men who'd been raised to believe emotions were the enemy. Finally free. Some chains are visible, heavy, metallic, cold. Others are quieter. They come in the form of expectations of silence, of the looks passed between fathers and sons when someone cries and no one speaks. The chain I inherited wasn't made of steel. It was built from generations of men who never learned how to feel, who went to war outside and never came home inside, who passed down their pain like a family heirloom disguised as honor. And for a long time, I believed carrying that pain was my duty. I thought being a man meant staying silent, enduring, bearing the weight without complaint. That's what I saw. That's what I was taught. But strength isn't silence. Courage isn't repression. Manhood isn't measured by how well you bury your feelings, but by your willingness to face them, to feel what scares you, to speak the truth even when it makes others uncomfortable, especially when it does. I'm not angry at my father anymore, not even at his father. They were doing the best they could with what they had. And what they had was pain, unspoken, untreated, unnamed. But understanding isn't the same as continuing. I will not pass this down. To my students, to my future children, to the boys in my classroom who flinch when their voices shake, I offer something different. A new inheritance. Permission. Permission to cry. Permission to speak. Permission to be afraid. And most of all, permission to break the chain. Because the real tradition worth building is not one of silence and suffering. It's one of healing. And healing doesn't always look dramatic. Sometimes it looks like a 10-year-old boy writing a poem about his dad. Sometimes it's a text message from a father who never used to say, "I'm proud of you." Sometimes it's two men sitting quietly on a porch, not speaking, but not hiding either. We think the past is a map, something to follow. But maybe it's just a warning sign. And maybe the bravest thing any of us can do isn't following a path, but turning around, walking back, and lighting the road for someone else. My name is Ryan Dean. My grandfather served in Vietnam. My father served in Desert Storm. My brother died in Afghanistan. And I served in silence. I broke the chain. And if you're still holding yours, you can too.